She bathed in virgin blood to stay young forever. Except she probably didn't. And that's just the beginning of what you've gotten wrong about history's most slandered aristocrat. The bloodbath thing is almost certainly garbage. Let's rip the bandage off immediately. That iconic image of Elizabeth Bathory lounging in a tub full of virgin blood, skin glistening with the essence of murdered maidens, it's almost certainly complete fiction. The blood-bathing story doesn't appear in any of the original trial documents from 1611. It doesn't show up in witness testimonies. It doesn't appear in any contemporary accounts written during her lifetime. Not a single person who knew her, worked for her, or testified against her mentioned blood-bathing. Not one. The first mention of this detail comes from a Jesuit priest named László Turoczi in 1729, a full 115 years after Bathory died. 115 years. Think about that for a second. That's not history. That's a game of telephone played across 4 generations. Turoczi was writing a sensationalist account designed to sell books and push a particular religious narrative about the dangers of Protestant nobility. He cited no sources. He provided no evidence. He just dropped this bombshell that somehow nobody mentioned for over a century, and everyone ran with it because it made for a great story. Historians, including Tony Thorne, whose book Countess Dracula remains the definitive English-language biography, and Kimberly Craft, author of Infamous Lady, have thoroughly debunked the blood-bathing myth. The logistics alone make it absurd. You'd need approximately 450 liters of blood to fill a standard bathtub. That's roughly 90 human bodies worth of blood. For one bath, blood coagulates within minutes of leaving the body. You'd be sitting in chunky gelatin, not rejuvenating liquid. The math doesn't math. The science doesn't science. The whole thing is medieval QAnon, with better marketing. The blood-bathing legend likely emerged from a combination of anti-Hungarian propaganda, Catholic Protestant tensions, and good old-fashioned misogyny toward powerful women who refused to know their place. Bathory was Protestant in a region where Catholic Habsburgs were aggressively consolidating power. She was wealthy beyond imagination. She was a widow who refused to remarry and hand her estates to a man. She was everything the establishment feared. So naturally, they made her a monster. They always do. She was obscenely, disgustingly rich. Elizabeth Bathory wasn't just wealthy. She was, I own more land than the King of Hungary, owes me money, wealthy. She was, my family tree includes kings and cardinals, and a guy who literally impaled people for fun, wealthy. The Bathory family was one of the most powerful noble dynasties in Eastern Europe, with branches stretching across Hungary, Poland, and Transylvania like some kind of aristocratic vine choking the region. Her uncle was Stephen Bathory, who served as King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania from 1576 until his death in 1586. Her cousin was Sigismund Bathory, Prince of Transylvania, a man so politically unstable he abdicated his throne 3 separate times. Another relative was supposedly Vlad the Impaler himself, though historians debate the exact connection. The point is, we're talking about peak aristocratic nobility here. The Bathorys were the medieval equivalent of old money, combined with political dynasty, combined with Game of Thrones-level family drama, except without the dragons and with more inbreeding. When Elizabeth married Ferenc Nadasdy in 1575, their combined estates made them the largest landowners in Hungary. They controlled dozens of villages, thousands of peasants, and strategic territory that even the Habsburg crown needed access to. At the height of her power, Bathory controlled around 17 castles and the surrounding lands. Her annual income exceeded that of most European monarchs. To put this in perspective, she could have purchased small kingdoms with her yearly allowance. The Hungarian crown literally owed her family money, debts that had accumulated over decades of financing royal military campaigns against the Ottomans. When Elizabeth was arrested in 1610, King Matthias II owed the Bathory estate approximately 17,408 gulden. Modern equivalents are tricky, but we're talking about several $1,000,000 in contemporary terms. Money the crown couldn't pay back. Money that conveniently became someone else's problem once Elizabeth was removed from the picture. Her son-in-law, Count György Thurzo, who just happened to lead the investigation against her, stood to inherit significant portions of her estate. The timing was impeccable. The motives were transparent. But sure, let's focus on the bloodbaths. Her husband was basically a medieval action hero, Ferenc Nadasdy, Elizabeth's husband, earned the nickname the Black Knight of Hungary for his ferocity against Ottoman forces. This wasn't some ceremonial title handed out for showing up to parties. The man spent most of his adult life on battlefields, fighting in the long Turkish War that consumed Central Europe from 1593 to 1606. He was renowned for military tactics that contemporaries described as ruthlessly effective. Some accounts claim he personally enjoyed torturing Turkish prisoners of war, behavior that was apparently acceptable when directed at the appropriate religious and ethnic targets. Here's what makes this interesting. Many of the torture methods later attributed to Elizabeth were techniques her husband openly used on enemy soldiers. The honey torture, where victims were covered in honey and left for insects to consume, standard military punishment for captured enemies, driving pins under fingernails, routine interrogation technique, burning flesh with heated implements. Just another Tuesday in the long Turkish War, the Iron Maiden that supposedly sat in Bathory's basement and features prominently in vampire movies. There's no archaeological evidence one ever existed in any of her castles. In fact, the Iron Maiden as a torture device is largely a 19th century invention, a composite created by museum curators who assembled random medieval artifacts into a dramatic display because tourists love that stuff. Medieval people had plenty of ways to hurt each other without needing elaborate mechanical contraptions that would have been expensive and impractical to manufacture. Nadasdy died in January 1604, leaving Elizabeth a widow at 44 with 4 surviving children. For 6 years after his death, she managed her vast estates without interference from the crown, the church, or anyone else. She attended to business, arranged marriages for her children, and maintained her position among Hungarian nobility. Then suddenly, in late 1610, accusations emerged. The timing suggests that while her husband was alive and commanding armies for the crown, nobody dared touch her. Once he was gone and she stood alone, without military protection or male authority to shield her, she became vulnerable. Convenient that she ran an empire while everyone else played war. Here's something the scary vampire lady narrative conveniently ignores. For decades, Elizabeth Bathory was an exceptionally competent estate manager in an era when women weren't supposed to manage anything more complicated than a household. While her husband was off fighting Ottomans for years at a time, sometimes returning only briefly before departing for another campaign, she single-handedly administered their massive land holdings. Contemporary documents show her negotiating grain prices with merchants, approving construction projects, managing disputes among peasant farmers, and maintaining diplomatic correspondence with Hungarian nobility and the Habsburg court. She handled finances so effectively that the estates not only remained solvent, but actually grew in value during her management. She funded the education of her children and arranged politically advantageous marriages that would secure the family's position for generations. Letters from her husband reveal that he trusted her judgment completely and deferred to her on all domestic matters while he was away fighting. This wasn't a woman hiding in a castle committing secret murders in her spare time. This was a high-profile administrator whose daily activities were witnessed by dozens of servants, guests, officials, and visitors. Her correspondence survives in Hungarian archives. Her financial records exist. Her legal decisions were documented. She was visible, accountable, and actively engaged in running a small empire. The idea that she simultaneously maintained this public life while secretly murdering hundreds of young women requires either supernatural abilities or willful ignorance of how noble households actually functioned. She also practiced medicine, a common and expected role for noble women of her era. The Bathory estates maintained extensive herb gardens, and Elizabeth was known to treat sick peasants and servants using the remedies and techniques considered standard practice at the time. Some historians suggest that deaths attributed to her torture may have been failed medical treatments, seizures during bloodletting procedures, or servants who died from common illnesses while under her care. In an era before germ theory, when bleeding patients was considered healing and mercury was medicine, deaths during treatment were tragically common. But when you're looking for a monster, every corpse becomes evidence of murder. The trial was a political hit job wrapped in legal theater. Elizabeth Bathory was never actually convicted of anything. Let that sink in for a moment. The most famous female serial killer in European history was never found guilty in a court of law. She never stood trial. She never faced her accusers in a formal legal proceeding. She never had an opportunity to examine evidence, cross-examine witnesses, or speak in her own defense. What happened instead was a political maneuver designed to seize her assets without the inconvenience of actual due process. In late December 1610, Count Gheorghe Thurzo raided Chakhtise Castle with armed soldiers in the middle of the night. He claimed to have personally caught servants in the act of torturing victims, though the only witness to this convenient discovery was Thurzo himself. No other soldier or official reported seeing anything incriminating. Thurzo immediately placed Bathory under house arrest and began interrogating servants. Within days, he had confessions. Within weeks, he had assembled enough testimony to justify permanent imprisonment. Here's where it gets interesting. King Matthias II wanted a public execution. He wanted Elizabeth Bathory tried, convicted, and killed in a way that would send a message to Hungarian nobility about their proper place under Habsburg authority. Thurzo, who was both Bathory's relative by marriage and stood to control her estates as Palatine of Hungary, argued strenuously against this approach. Why would Thurzo protect her from execution while orchestrating her imprisonment? The answer involves property law. If Bathory was executed for crimes, her properties would be forfeit to the crown. King Matthias would get the castles, the land, the wealth, everything. If she was merely confined without formal conviction, her estates could pass to her children, with Thurzo maintaining control as their guardian. Thurzo wanted her destroyed, but not convicted. He wanted her silenced, but not legally condemned. She was guilty enough to imprison forever, but technically innocent enough that her property rights remained intact. The whole thing stinks of politics dressed up as justice. The witness testimonies are wildly suspicious. Between 1,610 and 1,611, approximately 300 witnesses were questioned about Bathory's alleged crimes. This sounds comprehensive and thorough until you examine what actually happened during these depositions. Witnesses were questioned under duress, often after being arrested themselves. They were asked leading questions that suggested the answers interrogators wanted to hear. Many were questioned after learning what previous witnesses had said, allowing them to align their stories with established narratives. The testimonies show suspicious patterns. Multiple witnesses use identical phrases to describe events. They describe crimes in formulaic, almost ritualistic ways that suggest coaching or shared scripts. Variations between accounts often conveniently fill in gaps left by other testimonies, creating a patchwork narrative that seems designed to construct a case rather than document reality. Several key witnesses were servants who had been arrested and faced execution themselves. Under Hungarian law at the time, testimony extracted under threat of torture or death was admissible in court. These servants had every incentive to confirm whatever their interrogators wanted to hear. 4 servants, including Dorothea Sentes, Janos Ujvari, and Ilona Jo, were actually executed for their alleged participation in the crimes. Their confessions were obtained through torture, which they would have known was coming regardless of what they said initially. The victim counts provided by witnesses are all over the map. Some claimed dozens of victims, others claimed hundreds. One infamous account, from a servant named Susanna, claimed Bathory kept a personal register listing 650 victims in her own handwriting. This register was never produced as evidence. It was never shown to any other witness for confirmation. Nobody else reported seeing it. It exists only in one person's testimony, provided under interrogation by people who directly benefited from Bathory's conviction. The victim numbers make zero sense. Let's talk about the alleged body count, because nobody else seems willing to do basic arithmetic. Popular accounts claim Bathory murdered anywhere from 80 to 650 young women over a 25-year period. The higher number has become standard in sensationalist retellings. But even the lower figure doesn't survive scrutiny when you apply any practical analysis. At 650 victims over 25 years, that's 26 murders per year, one every 2 weeks, continuously, for a quarter century. Without anyone noticing, without bodies piling up, without family members asking questions, without servants gossiping, without a single contemporary accusation, until political circumstances made one convenient. These weren't anonymous peasants in isolated villages who could vanish without questions. Many alleged victims were minor noblewomen sent to Bathory's estates for education and courtly refinement, a standard practice among Hungarian aristocracy at the time. Wealthy families sent their daughters to learn etiquette, household management, and social graces from established noblewomen. These families would have noticed if their daughters stopped writing letters. They would have noticed if their daughters never came home. Noble families kept meticulous records. They exchanged correspondence constantly. The idea that dozens of noble families sent their daughters to Chaktis Castle, never to hear from them again, and nobody raised concerns for 25 years, defies basic logic. Historian Irma Sadecki Kardas examined parish records, death registries, and family archives from the region during Bathory's active years. She found no statistical anomaly in mortality rates, no cluster of unexplained deaths, no uptick in missing persons. Either Bathory was disposing of bodies so efficiently that no trace remained while simultaneously killing at industrial scale, or the numbers are fabricated. She was walled up alive, and that's terrifying enough. Here's what actually happened to Elizabeth Bathory, and it's genuinely horrifying without any embellishment needed. After her arrest on the 30th of December 1610, she was confined to Chaktis Castle without trial or formal sentencing. Rooms in the castle were bricked up, leaving only small openings for food delivery and air circulation. She remained imprisoned in her own home, in near-complete isolation, for almost 4 years. She couldn't leave those rooms. She couldn't see her children. She couldn't communicate with the outside world except through guards who reported to Count Thurzo. She couldn't speak in her own defense. She couldn't appeal her situation. She was simply walled in and forgotten, left to wait for death in darkness. Guards reported that she was found dead by a servant, who noticed her food hadn't been touched for multiple deliveries. The date was the 21st of August 1614. She was 54 years old. No cause of death was ever determined. No autopsy was performed. No physician examined the body. She was buried quickly in the Chaktis church, though her remains were later moved multiple times, and their current location remains uncertain. The woman who once commanded more wealth than most European monarchs died alone in the dark, denied every legal right her status should have guaranteed. Whether guilty of murder, guilty of excessive discipline in an era when beating servants was legal, or entirely innocent, the manner of her imprisonment was extrajudicial revenge. The Countess was inconvenient for everyone. Understanding Elizabeth Bathory requires understanding that she occupied an impossible position in 17th-century Hungarian society. She was a widow who refused to remarry, which meant she controlled her own estates rather than handing them to a new husband who would have proper male authority. She was Protestant in an era of aggressive Catholic counter-reformation when the Habsburgs were actively working to reclaim territories for the Church. She was creditor to a crown that had no intention or means of ever repaying her family's loans. She was mother to children who stood to inherit vast territories at a time when Habsburg consolidation made independent Hungarian nobles increasingly dangerous. Her arrest coincided suspiciously with her children reaching adulthood and her estates needing to transfer to the next generation. Her son Paul was 17 inches 1,610, approaching the age when he could legally claim his inheritance. If Bathory died or was removed from authority, guardians could control those properties for years longer. Count Thurzo, who led the investigation, had married his daughter into Bathory's family. His brother-in-law controlled key appointments. Every major player in her downfall stood to benefit financially from her removal. Every single one. Contemporary letters show that Thurzo was actually reluctant to investigate, until direct pressure from King Matthias made it politically impossible to refuse. The investigation began not when evidence emerged, but when the political winds shifted against her. Georgi Drugeth, another key figure in her arrest, had been negotiating to acquire Bathory lands for years before any accusations surfaced. These weren't neutral investigators pursuing justice. They were interested parties pursuing estates, and they found exactly what they needed to find. Nobody actually knows what happened. The honest historical assessment of Elizabeth Bathory is this: we don't know what she did. We know what her enemies claimed she did. We know what servants said under torture when their lives depended on cooperation. We know what a Jesuit priest invented a century after her death to sell books. We know what horror movies have repeated because Blood-Bathing Countess makes a better title than Widow Deprived of Due Process. Some historians believe she may have been guilty of excessive cruelty that crossed the line into homicide, behavior commonly overlooked among nobility until political enemies found it useful. Others argue she was essentially innocent, framed by debtors and land grabbers who exploited Protestant Catholic tensions and misogynistic assumptions about powerful women. The truth probably exists somewhere in that spectrum. What we can say with confidence is that the story you've heard is propaganda. The bloodbaths are fiction, invented a century too late. The victim counts are exaggerated or fabricated. The trial was a sham that never happened. The witnesses were coerced. The men who destroyed her profited enormously. That doesn't make her innocent, but it should make you suspicious of everything you think you know. 400 years later, we're still telling the version her enemies invented. Elizabeth Bathory wanted eternal youth through virgin blood? Maybe. Or maybe the real immortality was the slander we made along the way.